I think every cosplayer has those few very special characters that are their all-time favorites, their all-time dream cosplay projects. For me personally, it was Yennefer of Vengerberg from The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. I'm so thrilled that I had the chance to bring her to life, and I wanted to share with you how I did that. She's not just strong and cunning and feminine and unique, she also has one of my favorite character designs of all time. I feel like her design incorporates a lot of unique fabric techniques, accessories, textures, structures. Overall, I was really excited to work on this. So without further ado, let's get started. After looking at the reference, I decided to construct a vest with 6 front panels and 6 back panels. The base is connected to a waist flap at the bottom and to double sleeves, 1 short half sleeve and 1 longer sleeve. The vest is decorated with leather strips on most seams, incorporating hand stitching and thicker thread or yarn. My husband helped me wrap myself in saran wrap and tape for a tape pattern and traced the lines from the reference. I labeled them, traced them on paper, added seam allowance, and then I had ready pieces to make a mock-up. Following the reference, I decided to separate my pattern into 6 front pieces and 6 back pieces. Also, please don't mind the many scratches on my hands throughout this video. We have 3 cats and one of them was a kitten at the time. I traced the paper patterns onto an old bedsheet that I had, and then I started assembling them according to how I had them lining up at the tape pattern. Despite this being just the mock-up, I am still pressing the seams here, just to make sure everything lines up the way I want it to. After trying it on and seeing that it looks the way I want it to, I could move on to cutting it out from the real fabric. I found this perfect leaf pattern jacquard on AliExpress. To test how the leather strips are going to look like on the finished vest, I cut off a piece of the jacquard and ironed medium weight interfacing onto it. I sew a small piece of the leather strip onto this test square that I prepared, and then I tried different thicknesses and widths of decorative stitching with yarn. And once I was happy, I could start transferring the paper patterns onto the jacquard. I also burned off the edges before sewing because this fabric frays a lot. I do the same to medium weight interfacing as well as black cotton for the lining. Then I iron the interfacing onto the jacquard fabric and I mark where the neck opening begins. I'm doing this because I decided that the front is going to be stitched shut and in the back I'm going to have the zipper. I stitch all the pieces together with the top fabric as well as the lining, just how I practiced in the mock-up. Then I press the seams open with an iron both on the lining as well as the top fabric. I decided to pin and top stitch the most sensitive parts of the seams, which were the breast seams, as you can see here. Then I stitched the leather strip on top of each of those seams. And then came the tedious part of going through each of those stitches with double layered embroidery floss. This took a long time, and I actually needed to use my pliers to get the needle out every single time. This was undoubtedly the most time-consuming part of this project, but it was so worth it because look how cool this looks in the end. Once I was done with the decorative stitching, I could start attaching the front and back pieces together. I started by attaching the side seams, ironing them open of course, and then I moved on to attaching the shoulder seams, lining the leather strips together. And then I could get to attaching the zipper. I actually had the perfect length patent metal zipper in the navy color. I decided to use it because it's going to be covered by another leather strip anyway, and I'd rather be sustainable and not spend more money on this already expensive project. To make the sleeves, I used a simple sleeve pattern that I had from a different cosplay project I was working on, and with some minor adjustments, I made it perfect for Yennefer's double sleeve thing going on. Since the sleeve lining doesn't have a double sleeve, I just cut the full sleeve pattern out of the lining fabric and attached it to the lining sleeve hole. I used the small ironing board that I also got from AliExpress to press all the seams on the sleeves. For the top fabric, I traced the full sleeve as well as the half sleeve pattern and cut it out. I decided to line the small half sleeve with the same black jacquard fabric, so I actually cut it twice and then stitched them edge to edge and then folded them so that both insides would be touching each other. Then, similarly to the vest, I attached the leather strip, stitched it down, and added the decorative stitching. Then once this was done, I could just fold the half sleeve together and iron it, and it was done and lined. For the decorative stitching on the base sleeve itself, I measured the top of the sleeve and then I cut notches to show to myself where I'm going to draw the lines that are going to guide me for the embroidery floss later. At first I thought I could get away with just a single line of the embroidery floss, but in the end, just as I decided with the vest, I like the look when it's double folded. So I switched to a double folded white embroidery floss, and then I basically did the same thing I did to the vest. Once I finished with all the decorative stitching, I could iron on the interfacing onto the base sleeve. And then it was time to assemble the half sleeve with the base sleeve. To create the black and white ribbon trim at the end of her sleeves, I combined a wide cotton bias tape in white with a narrow satin bias tape in black, and I top stitched them together using a triple stitch in white thread. I marked every 30 centimeters with a pencil on this long trim, and then I just needed to cut them into an army of equal pieces. And then I could fold them into this particular shape that appears on the reference and secure with pins. For some truly mysterious and unknown reason, I decided to stitch the sleeves to the vest first and only then attach those ribbons. I don't know why. To recreate the detail that's on top of the ribbons on the sleeves, I fed a black rat tail yarn into pearl beads. And then I hand stitched every pearl in between every ribbon segment onto the sleeve. The bottom of the vest ends in this sort of peplum shape, so I did the same thing that I did to the rest of the vest. I patterned it using my old bed sheet, and then I transferred the pattern onto paper. According to the reference, there are two long pieces of this peplum thing in the front and a shorter one in the back, which I split into two even shorter ones to accommodate for the zipper that I have there. And same as the other pieces, I stitched on a leather trim. I used embroidery floss to make the hand stitch details, and I ironed interfacing onto the back. And then all I needed to do was to simply attach those pieces to the vest itself. I measured the circumference of the collar opening, and then I used those measurements to draft a pattern for the collar using a YouTube tutorial, which I will link below. As with the rest of the vest, I cut those pattern pieces out of black cotton for the lining and out of the jacquard for the top fabric. And then I simply attached the collar to the vest. Then I could finally get to the embellishments, such as the buttons. Yennefer has 10 buttons at the front of her vest. 3 of them are open, in quotation marks, and 7 of them are closed, also in quotation marks. I'm saying quotation marks because, as you remember, I sewed the front of my vest shut, leaving only the back for the zipper as the opening. I stitched the cotton lining all along the top collar seam, and then I turned it inside out, and I could finally start closing the lining by hand stitching. This is also the point where I added more of that rat tail yarn to create the closures for the open buttons. Underneath the vest, Yennefer is wearing a waist wrap with a flap that hangs around on top of her right thigh. It also has these ties at the bottom, 4 in the front and 4 in the back, so 8 total. I kinda had a totally different idea on how to do this part, so it sort of started as this really large rectangle. I later just decided to make it more fitting to my waist. I did that already after attaching the jacquard to the black lining cotton. For the ties, I just used black macrame yarn. I tied them into the same shape that I saw in the reference. I made 8 of these, and then I just hand stitched them to the bottom of the vest. I found these perfect yarn caps on AliExpress that looked just like the reference, and then I just super glued them to each tie. Onto Yennefer's bottoms. To me, they look like they were made out of stretch suede, especially in the in-game references. They have the same embroidery lines just like on the sleeves, and they also have a white line running down the sides of her thighs. I had a pair of bottoms that looked similar, so I used them to create a pattern. It's a simple pattern with an inner leg seam and a crotch seam. I traced the pattern onto black stretch suede and cut it out. Then I did a straight cut on the fold so that I could later insert a strip made out of white suede. Before attaching the white strip, I marked down the center of the thigh with pins so that I could place a decorative stitch similar to what I did on the sleeves. Once that was done, I could start attaching all the pieces with a triple stitch on my sewing machine. I didn't have a chance to film it, but I also added a waistband with an elastic on top. As it goes with patterns like these, the first seams to go together are the crotch seams, and later the leg seams. Then I hemmed the pants using a simple zigzag stitch. Onto the belt. Yennefer has this abnormally long, narrow brown leather belt that seems to knot into itself on the front. I found this perfect looking brown upholstery leather. I cut a matching strip out of the leather as well as brown linen for the lining. Fun fact, I actually ended up remaking this belt because it was way too wide, so some of the later clips are going to be with the new belt. I stitched all around the circumference of the belt, leaving a small palm-sized opening in the middle so that I could turn it inside out. Then I simply top stitched all around the belt. I created the belt holes using an awl, and then all I had to do was attach a buckle. Now let's talk about Yennefer's gloves. To me, the base glove looked like it was made from the same material that the pants were made of, so black stretch suede. There's also a leather bracer above it, as well as a fur bracer further up the glove. There's a bracelet of sorts with a gold and silver yarn, as well as decorative stitching all around the fingers. I started out by making some notes myself to map out where the stitches are supposed to be. The side, the thumb stitch, the thumb connection, and how it looks like. And then I went to watch and deeply study the videos of the absolute legend of gloves, Nicole Rudolph. I used her tutorial to create a fitted glove pattern that would be perfect for the size of my hand. The pattern pieces are as follows. The inner palm piece with the thumb cut out, the outer palm piece, the thumb piece, as well as narrow fourchets, otherwise known as gussets, to go in between each of the inner finger sections. The first step was to close the seams on the thumb, leaving the base of the thumb open, as well as add the small stitch to attach the fourchets, or again otherwise known as gussets, to each other. I managed to do most of the assembly of the glove on the sewing machine, however, to attach the thumb piece I had to do some hand stitching here. The next step was to pin and sew the gussets onto the inner parts of the fingers. I did this on only one side of the glove. Similarly to the bottoms, the stitch here was a triple stitch. Once all the gussets were sewn onto one side of the glove, I could pin and stitch the other side of the glove. To make sure no weird bunching happens, I trim off the excess on the inside. Then I turn them inside out and my base gloves are ready. Then I could begin the tedious work of adding those decorative stitches using thick cotton thread. I did this very slowly and carefully while wearing the gloves. To make the leather bracer that's on top of the glove, I wrapped myself in saran wrap and masking tape to make a pattern. I traced it out on paper and then I cut it out of black faux leather. I used pins as markers onto where to place the decorative stitching with embroidery floss. Once I was done, I ironed some interfacing onto the leather pieces. I traced the finished bracer onto some black cotton for lining. I stitched both the faux leather bracer as well as the lining into cones, and then I attached them together at the top. Then I turned them inside out and ironed them. Then I placed a simple stitch to close the edges together, wrong side to wrong side. This doesn't matter to me because the fur bracer is going to be covering this and hand stitched to the lining from the inside. And then I could attach the glove bases to the same stitch. To make a pattern for this fur trim that's on top of the glove, I actually just cut the bracer pattern in half. To cut the fur, I lay the fabric with the underside facing me, and then I go in with very small scissors, making sure that I'm only catching the base of the fabric and none of the fur hairs. This is done to eliminate any jagged edges in the fur. Once the pieces are cut and ready, I brush the fur away from where the stitches are going to be, to make sure that none of the fur gets caught in the stitch. Then I stitch the side seams together and turn it inside out to create a continuous fur trim. Then I stitch the fur trim onto the edge of the glove to enclose the outer seam. I wasn't sure exactly where the leather bracer is going to come up to, therefore I did not continue all of the decorative stitches on the glove base seams, so at this point, now that I know where they end, I'm going to complete them. And now for the final detail. To make the bracelets, I used this perfect braided trim in silver and gold that I found on AliExpress. I burned the edges a bit to prevent fraying. I used a roll of yarn here to mimic the circumference of my wrist, and I put it inside the glove. Then I just wrapped those yarns around, made a knot, and then I glued it with E6000, and I used this clamp to keep it together overnight. And this is the finished glove. I have to say this was one of my favorite parts to make out of this whole project. On top of her vest, Yennefer wears a shawl that ties in the front with the same silver and gold braid and from the same black fur that's on the gloves. I put the vest on my mannequin and then I made a pattern out of baking parchment. I cut the fur the same way that I showed in the glove section and then I bag-lined it with black cotton. I stitched in the braid trim at this stage as well. I used the same cord caps as before and I super glued them at the ends of the braid trims. Tweezers really helped at this stage. Onto the boots. Yennefer is wearing black leather thigh-high, high-heel boots. The boots are skin-tight up until the knee and then they are loose up until the mid-thigh. There are a few more three-dimensional details, like the ankle harness, the harness that holds some of the belts together all along the leg up to the knee, and more. I found these base boots online. They are black leather and come to just above the knee. I put the boots on and then I wrapped myself in saran wrap and masking tape to make a pattern for all the three-dimensional pieces. Then just like before, I transferred them to paper and cut them out. I also drafted this large pattern for the thigh-high piece that goes above the knee. I cut all my pattern pieces out of black faux leather and then I ironed some interfacing onto them. I bag-lined all these pieces with black cotton and then I turned them inside out and ironed them to make sure they're flat. For the back harness of the boot, I just used the same leather strips I used for the vest. I also made small belt loops out of the same faux leather that I used for the rest of the parts. Here's an overview of the pieces after I top stitched most of them. To insert buckles into the belt, I marked a hole and then I punched it using an awl. I inserted the buckle into the hole and then I stitched it shut. Following that, I hand-stitched the belt loop into each belt. I measured each belt around the circumference of the area where it should go at the final boot, then I punched another hole with an awl at that point, and then I inserted an eyelet. Now it was time to figure out how to attach all of these components to the boots. First, I slid the ankle harness onto the boot, then I put the boot on, and then I started pinning the front harness so that I know where to hand stitch it once I take them off. To secure the ankle harness, I found a scrap of a stretchy black fabric that I could just attach to both ends that go underneath the heel. The upper thigh edge of the boot appears to have a gold stitching in the reference, so I did a triple stitch and gold thread on my machine. Then I could machine stitch the thigh part to the boot. For the back of the thigh belt, I just created a loop out of the same leather strip I used for the back harness and for the vest. Then, using E6000 and a plastic tube inserted into the boot to mimic the circumference of my shin, I glued the other parts of the front harness which were hard to stitch on. I spray painted with silver some flat back pearls. Then I superglued them to the ankle harness to create the details on the reference. And then the boots were done. Here's a final look at them. This next part might not be very visible from the outside, but it's just as important as the rest of the parts. Yennefer is wearing a white undershirt underneath the vest. Since I had free rein with the pattern here, I just decided to make it a simple shirt. I used a button-up shirt that I already owned to draft a pattern. I also repurposed the sleeve pattern from the vest. I also quickly drafted some cuffs, and I used the same collar pattern that I used for the vest in this case as well. I traced my patterns onto white, lightweight viscose. I cut them out and then ironed some interfacing on the cuffs and collar. Almost all of the stitches on this undershirt were done using a French seam. On the cuff opening, I just blended the French seam into 2 double folded seams. I added a buttonhole on each of the cuffs using my buttonhole presser foot. However, this can also be done with a regular foot using a tight zigzag stitch. I added the same button that's on the front of the vest here. I didn't get to film much of the shirt, so I'm sorry about that. I really wanted a prop for this cosplay, and what could be better than Yennefer's crystal skull, which Geralt returns to her in Witcher 3. My 2 main points of reference were the in-game model and the official replica available in the shop. In the end, I decided to go for something in between. You'll see. I made a base out of cardboard tubes hot glued together, and I added scrunched up aluminum foil to block out the major shapes. And then I could start sculpting. In this case, I'm using Chavant LBT sulfur-free clay. Once I felt that I got the general shape down with clay, I could go in with my sculpting tools. I used a combination of smoothing movements with the round tools as well as shaving movements with the flat tools. I also left a bit of texture with the small round tools to mimic the organic texture of a skull. Then it was time to create a mold of my sculpt. I'm using 3 layers of Rebound 25 by Smooth On, which is a very viscous brush-on silicone. I make sure to closely follow the manufacturer's instructions. I chose a brush to sacrifice for this next step. I slowly started spreading the silicone all over my sculpt. I did this in 3 layers until my crystal skull looked absolutely gnarly. To make a rigid mold jacket, I blocked off half of my sculpt with aluminum foil. Then I applied layers of strips of plaster of Paris with water to create the hard shell. Once the first half was dry, I wrapped the whole thing with saran wrap, and then I made the second half using more strips of plaster of Paris. Once I deemed them dry enough, I could separate them and reveal my rigid mold jacket. Now it was time to demold, so I made a few entry cuts with my X-Acto knife into the silicone. A lot of parts of this project were fun, but this was the most satisfying. Once I had the clean mold, I put it into the mold jacket and it was time to do some rotocasting. I'm using Smoothcast 300 from Smooth On. This is a 2-part resin that cures white and extremely quickly. So I mix it quickly but thoroughly, then I immediately pour it into the mold and start spinning it around, making sure that a thin layer of resin is coating the entire thing on the inside. I can't stress this enough, but if you're going to be working with resin or silicone, please make sure you read the safety instructions and protect yourself with the proper equipment. In total, I did 3 layers of this resin. Maybe I lied before. This is the most satisfying part of this project. I had some unexpected resin spillage, so I'm cleaning it out very carefully with an X-Acto knife. To keep my cast solid but lightweight, I'm just stuffing it with some foam clay. I smooth it down with some water, and once it's dry, I go in with some sandpaper to really blend it into the cast. I also sand the cast itself a little bit. Some of the edges were still a little bit rough, so I used Quick Seal to blend them in. For some reason, I don't know what happened in terms of me filming the painting process, but I did not film me painting the skull black as a base, and I very badly filmed myself adding the silver details on top. This is kind of dreadful. Yeah, I guess I was really crunching at that point. I ended up covering the skull with some UV resin to give it that crystal look, but I didn't film that either. After looking at the pendant on Yennefer's necklace, I decided that this would be a great opportunity for me to advance my 3D modeling skills. I started by creating an SVG format file with the outlines of the pendant so that I could later extrude them into a model. Then I extruded and stylized it in Autodesk Fusion. I sent the file to a local business so that they could print it out in resin for me, and then I sanded it a little to prep it for painting. I painted a few base layers with black acrylic, and then I added details with silver and gold Posca markers. For some of the harder to reach areas, I just squeezed out some of the Posca ink and then I went in with a brush. That same leather strip that I used for the vest and everywhere else is making a final return, and it's going to be the base of the necklace. I attached a regular snap by hand for the closure. Then, using 2 jump rings and pliers, I attached the pendant to the necklace base. For Yennefer's hairstyle, I used a black wavy lace front wig. I think I was really crunching it at that point, so I don't really have videos of this. It required very minimal styling. I just trimmed it a bit and gave it that side-swept look. When doing her makeup, I especially focused on her dark purple smoky eye look, high cheekbones, and this reddish but natural color lipstick. And with that, this project was done. Please enjoy some close-up details. This video came out to be much longer than I expected, but I wanted to thank you so much for watching and staying until the end. I hope this video was helpful. See you next time!